Yeah, can I ask the other panelists to please show their videos again so we can start today's webinar? Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar series, Zooming In on Migration and Asylum, which is a joint initiative by the Horizon 2020 projects AdmiGov, MAGYC, MICNEX, and TRAFIG. We're happy to have you here and to have so many participants here, active participants in the Zoom meeting on the one hand, and also so many listeners who registered to the start of this series. So a couple of weeks ago, we came together as projects and thought, okay, how can we somehow also enhance our outreach under these quite difficult conditions with the corona pandemic. And so this idea came up to not only start individual webinars, sort of where we present our respective work, projects work, but to join forces and developing a new webinar series for this. So the aim of this webinar series is to expand our collective knowledge base on some of the most, well, what we see pressing issues, problems in the field of migration, protracted displacement, the multiple so-called crises in the field, and also to well, start a discussion and engage with people about what kind of solutions we can find in this field. So we want to establish this webinar series as a platform for mutual learning, reflection, and evidence-based discussion, and also, of course, public outreach for other Horizon 2020 projects and their participating researchers, but in particular for interested audiences, for people working in practice, working in policy, or who are dealing with the issues of migration, asylum, and displacement in their everyday lives as well. So in this webinar series, we'll have monthly sessions that will be led by different partners, different projects here, and it will normally always be the last Tuesday of each month when this will take place. And so today we'll be speaking about doing research on migration and asylum, responsibilities and limits. We will just reflect about our own roles in producing knowledge in this field. And the next session at the end of August, we'll look at the pandemic and how it changed migration governance, and will be led by the MAGYC project. So some to the audience and also for our discussants, some technical instructions to start off with. Sort of you, the participants, you won't be able to put something in the chat, but there you will find a question and answer bottom at the bottom of your screen, and we would ask you to point specific questions you have to the respective speakers or to the discussion in general. Please put them into this Q&A format. Please also then always address one of the speakers directly. And then later in the last part of today's discussion, we will read out some of, well, we have to select probably some of the questions and discuss them over the last 20 or 30 minutes. In general, sort of this webinar will be recorded. It's not being live streamed, but we will make it available at a later stage via YouTube or our respective websites. Okay, let me introduce myself. My name is Benjamin Etzold. I'm a senior researcher at the Bonn International Center for Conversion, which is a think tank in the field of peace and conflict studies. I, in my work, I focus on migration and displacement issues mainly, and I'm the scientific coordinator of the TRAFIG project, which my colleague Caroline will introduce in a second. So now for the first round, I would like the speakers to quickly present the respective projects that are jointly initiated this series. And as François Gemenne is not yet with us, I would like to ask Caroline Jacobs to start with her presentation. Let me introduce you first. So Caroline Jacobs is assistant professor at the Van Vollenhoven Institute for Law, Governance and Society at the Leiden University in the Netherlands. She works in the TRAFIG project, Transnational Figurations of Displacement, and there she leads an empirical work package on transnational figurations of displacement in Africa, mainly focusing her own work, focusing on internal displacement in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So please, Caroline, please unmute yourself and share your screen for a quick intro to the project.
Yes, I hope you can hear me and you can see my screen now. Yeah.
Perfect, yes.
Yes, so we are now in the second year of our project, which investigates long-lasting displacement situations at multiple sites in Asia, Africa, and Europe. Displacement is often seen as something temporary, as transitional, but for more than 2/3 of the world's refugees, displacement is long-term. They don't see possibilities for one of the durable solutions like return, resettlement, or local integration. And the same goes for a large part of the world's internally displaced, and this is what protracted displacement is about. And in TRAFIG, we hope to generate knowledge on the situation of these people, and in so doing, help to develop solutions for protected displacement that are better tailored to the needs and capacities of the persons affected. And we are especially interested in getting a better understanding of their transnational and local networks and their mobility, and how connectivity and mobility are used as resources to cope in their everyday lives. So TRAFIG is grounded on the concept of transnational figurations, which stresses the networks and interdependencies of displaced people at distinct places, but in particular across borders of nation states. Our central hypothesis here is that the more connected and mobile refugees and internally displaced people are, how the screen is not showing. So the more connected they are and the more mobile, the less likely it is that they end up in a situation of protected displacement and vice versa. So our research thus focuses on the local and transnational connectivity and mobility of people, which includes both displaced people, but also host communities. And it might sound very logical and self-evident, but we believe that researchers, policymakers, and practitioners often nevertheless take a more static and place-based perspective that makes it difficult to see these connections and to see these mobility patterns. So here you see how we have divided our research into 5 main teams. The first team, we started with a thorough analysis of humanitarian aid, asylum, and migration policies, which was mostly through desk research. And the empirical research is meant to, which is currently in process, to help us to see how displaced navigate these governance regimes. Then under team 2, we look at people's everyday lives, the livelihoods they develop, and to what extent they manage or are stuck in limbo. Then team 3 pays close attention to people's networks and how they make use of connections and mobility to seek protection, to secure livelihoods, and to move out of their situation of protectedness. And then team 3 looks more at people's intergroup connections, and in team 4 we focus more on the new connections that people make and the intergroup relations between refugees and hosts, how the integration unfolds, and which images and perceptions people have of each other. And then finally, team 5 is about the economic impact of displaced people, which obviously can be both a burden but can also be a blessing for host communities. So how do we do this and where do we do it? You can see here that we make use of a mixed methods approach that helps us to triangulate and validate our findings. We started with a joint methods handbook that was then further adjusted and refined at country levels in the country teams. And this way we ensure that our research is both comparative between countries and between groups of displaced people, but also pays enough attention to the particularities of each context and each setting. So for instance, in Congo, where our research is with IDPs and not with refugees, a number of questions about legal protection, for instance, are much less relevant, and instead we focus more on their relation with the local authorities. So also each country team clearly has particular skills, particular experience, particular backgrounds, and this is what all researchers bring into the project as well, which means that there are slight differences in focus and an emphasis on the research methods that are used, but overall these are the methods that we employ. Our research is with Afghans, with Syrian and Eritrean refugees, and with Congolese refugees and IDPs. We collect data in Pakistan, in Jordan, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Congo, and then in Europe, in Greece, Italy, and Germany. And we are sort of considering additional countries depending on the mobility and the connectivity that we trace in these first stages of the empirical research. So some of the research is carried out in displacement camps, in refugee centers, and other research is carried out with displaced living in host communities. Clearly, if we do research, we have the responsibility both towards our funders and towards our informants to disseminate our findings. And speaking here as an academic, I think this has not always come very naturally to us. And therefore it's a major advantage to be in a collaborative project with different consortium partners on board with different skills and contexts as well. And some of our partners are clearly much better in creating this impact than others are. So we've developed a strategy to create impact and to disseminate our findings through various channels, the more traditional ones like the policy briefs, the reports, also the digital ones where we use social media, develop an interactive toolkit for practitioners to assess protected displacement, and a series of events like this one, but also events on a local level where we carry out our field research and to talk with stakeholders involved. This is our team. You see a list of partners, but you also see that we have these different backgrounds. Some are more practice-oriented, others more policy-oriented, and others more academic. And together we hope that we can create this impact and take up the responsibility that we have in the project. So that's, I think, very briefly, the summary of the project. So I will give back the floor to Benjamin.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Caroline, for an introduction into the TRAFIG project. I'm also now very happy to see François Gemenne, who just joined us for today's webinar. Let me introduce François to you. He's the director of the Hugo Observatory, a research center specifically dedicated to research on the nexus between environmental changes, climate change, and mobility at the University of Liège in Belgium. And he's also lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris, and he's principal investigator of the MAGYC project, which stands for Migration Governance and Asylum Crisis. Please, François, quickly introduce the project, please. And unmute yourself.
There we are. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for giving me the floor, and thanks a lot for the organization of this webinar series. I think it's a great initiative that the sister projects on migration and asylum work together on this. A few words on MAGYC, which, as you said, stands for Migration Governance and Asylum Crisis in the EU. And as the name says, the project revolves very much around the idea of crisis and tries to analyze how migration and asylum policies in the EU are framed, formatted, shaped by crisis imaginaries and rhetorics. And what I would say that the starting point of the project is that it seems that the EU lacks really a real coordinated migration and asylum policy, and that the only policy moves that are made by the EU are always in reaction to a crisis, be it the externalization of procedures, be it a potential reform of the Dublin Convention, and so on and so forth. Everything seems to be shaped by crisis. So what we do in the project is, first, we examine to what extent these crises do indeed shape migration and asylum policy in the EU, and we do so at different levels of government, from the local level to the national level and the European level. And we also examine different types of contexts with regard to different flows of migrants and asylum seekers, comparing the different types of policy reactions that these flows induced. And then, of course, we will suggest different policy alternatives. I'd like to say that very often we're under the impression that migration and asylum decisions are made because that's the only possible alternative, because there is no other choice, because it is either that or the chaos. And what we would like to do in the project is really to try and explore some policy alternatives that would no longer be shaped by crisis, but that would take a proactive look, a proactive outlook on the evolution of migration flows and migration dynamics. And we started at the end of 2018, and this is a project that will span over 4 years.
Okay, thanks, François, for this very concise introduction of the MAGYC project. I would hand over to Jürgen Carling from PRIO. PRIO stands for Peace Research Institute, Oslo, where Jürgen is Professor of Migration and Transnationalism Studies. And together with others, he developed the MAGYC project, which stands for Aligning Migration Management in the Migration Development Nexus. And he also leads an ERC consolidator project on future migration as a present fact. Please, Jürgen, quickly introduce MAGYC.
Thank you. So it's really exciting to be here in this webinar series. Like the others, I'm very happy to be able to make more connections across the projects. So MAGYC was developed in response to a call that asked for projects that took on the challenge of fully addressing the root causes of migration and exploiting the potential of migration as a development enabler. That was sort of the request, the demand from the European Commission that we tried to respond to with the project. So a big challenge. And our basic idea in addressing that was that we have essentially two fields of research and policy. On the one hand, we have the field of migration management, which has become very central to research and policy alike, and which at European level is part of the policy field of justice and home affairs, and which has to do with essentially regulating migration flows. On the other hand, we have the field of migration and development, or what's often referred to as the migration development nexus, so the different ways in which migration and development might shape each other. And as a policy field that sorts under development cooperation usually, so that's both at the national and at the EU level. And our approach to the challenge that was posed by the call was that we said that both of these are well-developed fields of research and policy, but they remain poorly connected. So the ambition really of MAGYC is to bring them together into one frame and to see how, on the one hand, migration management, which tends to see migration as potentially a bad thing, and the migration development nexus, which sees migration as potentially a good thing, can be brought together in a more coherent policy framework. But in order to say anything meaningful about policy, we also have to understand the underlying mechanisms better. And we took the approach that a lot of the more sort of important or interesting mechanisms that work here don't really play out at the national level, but at the subnational level of local communities and regions. So our main empirical focus is not at the national level, but below the national level. So we've selected 10 countries that we work with. We did that already at the proposal stage. And afterwards, we spent a lot of time picking 25 local communities, 2 or 3 in each country, that together represent a really interesting diversity of contexts. Some are booming, some are stagnating, some are in crisis, some are insecure. So by studying this diversity, we hope to understand more about what drives migration and what impacts migration have at the origin. And the methodology reflects this. So we have at the level of the research area, a big sample survey, 500 respondents in each of the 25 areas. And we also have qualitative research in the form of focus groups, key informant interviews, and observation. And at the country level, we do a policy review to assess the national policy context. And of course, we use all of these different components to inform the analysis and publications that we produce, and we'll also produce public data sets so that the data can be used beyond what we have capacity to do. One of the interesting things I think that we do in this project is to pull the different forms of data together by means of so-called QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, that allows us to use, for instance, survey data and focus group data and key informed interviews together and to compare and contrast and learn from variation across these 25 local areas. This is our team. We're now 26 people across 9 institutions. We've worked together for a year and a half. By the time COVID struck, we had just completed the pilot fieldwork, and then we've spent most of the time since March on refining and developing the methodology. So now we're all set to start the data collection whenever that's possible in the context of COVID-19. So the institutions that are in the projects are these, led by my institution, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, and including partners across Europe and in Africa and Asia. Finally, then on outreach and engagement, of course, we do a lot of the same things as the other projects do. So I'll try to concentrate on what is perhaps different. We have designed something that none of us had done in exactly this way before. We have an end user board of people who are not researchers, but end users in government or in national organizations who might be able to apply MAGYC's insights in their work. So they're following the project closely throughout the 5 years, and they're expected to really sort of understand the logic and processes of the project and engage with that. And then in addition, we have a big panel of more than 100 people who are not expected to devote a lot of time or effort in understanding every detail of the project, but who we can use as a sounding board on specific issues. And for instance, they will be able to vote on the topics for policy briefs when we have different options that we could choose to pursue. In addition, we have worked in other ways than I'm used to in really bringing research communication and research management and research quality together. So we're not sort of bringing in some communication partner from the side, but we have one partner, the Overseas Development Institute, which is very strong on research communication to start with, and which has both a research role and a communication role in the project. And we, as the central coordination of the project, also spend a lot of time and effort on the communication components. So I'm really enthusiastic in terms of how these two are able to mutually reinforce each other. I think the research becomes much better when we think communication throughout. And of course, the communication benefits from our effort to do really high quality research. So that was a brief introduction of MAGYC. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Jürgen, for introducing MAGYC. Then I would pass on to Julien Jean de Bos. He's teaching international relations and European studies at the Department of Political Science at the University Libre de Bruxelles. He's also has been involved with the Sciences Po in Paris, and he's involved in ADMIGOV project. And ADMIGOV stands for Advancing Alternative Migration Governance, and a project which is led by the University of Amsterdam. So Julia, please quickly introduce your project, maybe also point to differences or similarities in our respective approaches. Can't hear you yet.
Hi, sorry, I had a little problem with the technical problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me share the screen with you. Yeah, that would be the one. And yes, is it working now? Perfect. All right, so thank you very much, Benjamin, for all of your efforts in organizing this. I should immediately specify that I'm standing in today for Anja van Helsum from the University of Amsterdam, who is the scientific coordinator of the project. So the project is ADMIGOV, and that stands for Advancing Alternative Migration Governance. As you can see, we are a consortium of 11 academic partners and 2 non-academic partners We're based in 7 EU member states and 4 EEA and third countries. And the consortium is led, as I mentioned, by the University of Amsterdam. So why do we call it Advancing Alternative Migration Governance? The kind of main objective of the project is to design a set of indicators of good European Union migration governance. And indicators we essentially understand as scoring tools that will allow us to assess existing or foreseen migration governance measures, and more importantly, that will allow others, including policymakers, to do the same exercise. There's 2 essential elements to goodness and the way we understand it. One is instrumental. It simply is about whether a particular measure meets the policy goals that were set for it. And the other one is normative in the sense that we ask and we try to understand whether a specific measure complies with the political and legal commitments of the EU and the member states. And here we ground this in UN principles, especially those outlined in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, so especially SDG 10.7, and follow-ups to this, including the 2018 Global Compact on Migration. In both cases, the research that we do throughout the project, and I will detail this in a minute, the focus of that research is on the practice of migration governance on the ground. So what we're less interested in a kind of top-down perspective that starts with policy objectives and general programs regarding migration governance, and more interested in looking at how in specific sites and places and circumstances migration governance actually works. So that means that on the one hand, across the project, we work to understand the concrete effects of existing and ongoing policies in the field of migration governance. And we also work to identify bottom-up alternatives to current migration governance. So we know that in a variety of contexts involving migration as well as international protections, local frontline actors have been incredibly creative in kind of coping with the limitations or the kind of assumptions that are baked in national and EU policies with regard to migration. And one of the ambitions of the project is to design indicators that will allow to reflect this creativity and these alternatives that already exist, but that are in a lot of cases not known or ignored. To this end, we have a twofold research strategy. On the one hand, the project focuses, and usually this coincides with a specific work package. The project looks at specific moments, places, or stages in migration processes, and specifically 3 of them: entry, what happens when people try to access the territory of an EU or Schengen state; stay, and in particular here, the project will focus on labor and circular migration schemes; and exit, including deportation or voluntary, so-called voluntary return. On the other hand, the second stream, a thread of research, focuses on the implementation of what we see as 2 critical principles in global migration governance. That would be protection, and that would include not only international protection, but also safety. And that is the idea of orderly, legal, and safe pathways for international migration and mobility that you find in the Global Compact on Migration. And the other kind of focus here is on sustainable development and the analysis of how development and migration operate together, and that's already something that is the focus of other projects. Much like the other projects represented here today, we implement a multi-method research design that combines legal analysis of migration governance frameworks, qualitative data collection and analysis through interviews, open or semi-structured ethnographic fieldwork, as well as documentary research, but also quantitative analysis that uses or adds to existing data sets, including large multi-country surveys. We have 4 third countries in which we're working as well, on migration decision-making in relation to development intervention and transit situations. But what is I think important is that we didn't make a choice to either look at efforts to govern migrations or to look at persons who are supposed to be governed through migration governance, but we try to combine both perspective and both ends in the project. In terms of stakeholder engagement, since Benjamin asked us to comment specifically on this, For us, the kind of first category of stakeholders that we want this project to speak to are migrants themselves, either indirectly, in the sense that we hope that by designing indicators of good governance that reflect some of the on-the-ground alternative ways of governing migration, we can contribute to some degree of discussion on the current directions of migration governance, but also policymakers, but also by asking migrants, to participate themselves in this research by telling us the stories and by recounting the stories they tell us that are behind the numbers, the data, the figures that we can gather. The other stakeholders are fairly more common, more usual: policymakers, civil society, academia, of course, and members of the public at large. In terms of the engagement, finally, the very objective of the project, shaping, creating indicators, is an engagement strategy. We're also working with developing learning modules, so what is usually called a massive online courses, 7 lessons of 30 minutes, which will be available online, that can be used in academic and non-academic settings. Hopefully the first one will come out in September. And as the other projects have, paper series and reports that are fully available online, policy briefs and workshop events, including webinars now, and as well as cooperative workshops with civil society organizations. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Julia. Yeah, interesting also to see like the similarities and differences in the respective approaches that we're taking on, and also noting sort of all of our projects, we're dealing with migration policies, asylum policies, but then also how the effects of these policies are felt on the ground and how they're experienced by migrants or refugees and other groups. So if you please stop sharing your screen, Julia. I would ask Luca Lici now to present and speak. Hang on a second. If you just try to end screen sharing, Julia. Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah, Luca, please unmute yourself. Luca Lici is Migration Policy Officer at the Director General Research and Innovation at the European Commission. He would say he's the go-to guy for us projects in the field of migration and asylum and displacement, trying to establish links between us researchers, between the projects and respective people in the policymaking arena and in the Commission. He himself also, he shifted sides. I don't know, would call it sides, but he moved from academia into the Commission. So he did a PhD on migration governance in Sheffield and at the European University Institute in Florence. And he's worked also for DG Migration and Home Affairs before he joined DG Research. So Luca, from your side, maybe you would just quickly address sort of so if there has been a lot of calls on migration issues around the last couple of years in the Horizon program. So maybe a few general words about your Commission's expectations towards these projects and towards also us researchers, and in how far we can inform or should inform, have to inform policy making.
Sure. Sure, yeah. So quite briefly, because I know we'll pick up on some of the points later on in the discussion as well. But first of all, really thank you for the invitation, but also for organizing this. I think it's really a great initiative. In January, we had started the process from the Commission through which we wanted really to pull the strings and build a stronger network across all the research projects that we are funding. And just as a reminder, between 2018 and 2020, we funded 100 million in migration research projects, which amounts to about 30 projects, which is a real big amount if we consider also the number of people involved in each project. So we had a first cluster meeting, to call it, in January, and we were foreseeing a few others in the coming months. Of course, COVID changed that. So it's really great to see that the projects themselves got the ball rolling in that direction, really pulling these strings together. just very briefly on Horizon research, maybe. So first of all, Horizon 2020, which funds many of your projects, is soon coming to an end. We are transitioning towards Horizon Europe, which will be the next framework program. It's also something to keep in mind. As Ben said, I work for DG Research and Innovation. And to clarify, our role is to write up research work programs and follow up in their implementation, especially as regards the policy implications for projects funded, while all the management of the projects is given to my great colleagues in REA, the Research Executive Agency, which follow the projects more closely. So I think the main difference with Horizon Research compared maybe to other funding opportunities is its top-down nature, as we call it here in our jargon, meaning kind of its focus on impact, its inclusion of a sort of directionality in what we are aiming for. We are ourselves trying to get better at this. There's always room for improvement, of course, and we are working to improve the guidance to really explain what we mean by this. But as we've got such a big investment that is coming really to maturity now, some of the projects involved in this seminar and others as well are in their first, second year of life out of 3 or 4 years. It's really the time to strengthen these relations, to maximize the potential of this research. So I myself, as Ben said, I kind of come from research, and I'm not a fanatic, let's say, in the sense that all research needs always to have policy implications, recommendations, etc. I'm well aware of the importance of research, such as, I don't know, theoretical research, for example, to be important in its own right, so to say. But let's say that who gets into Horizon Research and who is funded through Horizons needs to sort of come around the fact that we are really looking for a clearer policy cut and a clear policy implications of this research that we are funding. Now, just to nuance this, of course, this focus on impact does not mean that this creates a direct link between the research outputs and just the policy uptakes. The same difficulties we're all aware of, and we're here to discuss actually today as well, are our daily bread and butter, even within the Commission. So these are difficulties framing migration governance more broadly, of course. But so having a Horizon 2020 migration projects and really working in one, I think also means developing useful ways to conceptualize and frame the relation between research and policy. And yeah, for example, coming together as a group of projects like you are doing. And, you know, this really makes sense in aiming for an objective, which is collectively is much easier to be achieved, and really building a community that really can speak also with a stronger voice rather than just a constellation of different projects. So I think this is really important. Now, I know some of the projects here as well signed recently a letter as well, I'm sure, on funding and disregarding and the relations between research and policy. I'm sure we'll talk about it maybe later. So I'm sure there are also, yeah, there's room for discussion, let's say, in these elements that I said. So I think that's looking forward to having this discussion later today. Yeah. So just as a mean of introduction, I think I'll close it there if it's okay for you, Ben.
Okay, thanks, Luca. Yeah, you already addressed a lot of points that we will come back to in more detail now. So I think to start off the discussion now, sort of, we certainly see sort of, I mean, now in this time of the year also, we just had the new UNHCR Global Trends report 2 weeks ago. We had the European Asylum Support Office's annual report being published, or the IDMC's report in May on internal displacement trends. We always see the reports and data coming through Frontex or so, or the IOM or other big institutions. And we sometimes also have the impression sort of that it's also mainly quantitative data and the results of quantitative data collection efforts by large institutions that also shape and influence and feed into policy making to a very large extent. So, and then on the other hand, sort of we have projects like ours. We are researchers. We are independent. We do not have a specific institutional mandate. We somehow also, I mean, of course, bound by the respective calls to which we react. We choose what we want to do and what we want to achieve. And we also, well, we produce new knowledge in fields, and we also have this. Of course, we are assessed also on the basis of academic excellence, but also we still have this identity of being primary researchers, many of us. On the other hand, of course, the expectation is clear, and that's also why we want to contribute in this Horizon 2020 programs. We want to inform, we want to interact with practice, policy, and the public. And you also saw in the project introductions that we're using very different formats for stakeholder engagements. So we see ourselves as innovators, also and to some extent as policy advisors or even change makers, but admittedly also with very different degrees of success. We also know that a lot of very excellent work in this field in this very highly politicized field of migration and asylum is being bluntly ignored by policy. There's clearly a very different logic that policy development follow rather than sort of the new knowledge being produced by academic circles. Also this webinar series, we see this as a part of kind of reflexive exchange between ourselves to ask ourselves how we are doing research on migration and asylum, to question also ourselves sort of what kind of knowledge we want to produce, also think, okay, who are really the primary recipients and beneficiaries of our research, and particularly also what, in which forms do migrants and refugees and other groups benefit from our research. But we also see and we want to discuss the limits of our research. And now in the second round, I would like to ask the discussants to dig a bit deeper and start with François from MAGYC. Also asking sort of, I mean, sort of we as researchers, we have different projects here and we often also compete with one another in the kind of knowledge we produce and the visibility we achieve with our respective projects. So do we think sort of our projects and the kind of work we're doing is just going side by side, but I don't hardly see any real comparison or synthesis. Do you think it's necessary or possible to align the findings of such different projects and to jointly produce knowledge in this field? Also in order to be heard better, what Luca just said.
Thanks, Benjamin. Well, yes, I think it is certainly important that we try and connect better with each project. As this webinar series illustrate, we are very willing and ready to collaborate with each other. This being said, I think it's important to recognize that each project is different and seeks to shed a specific light on a specific aspect of a very complex reality. And therefore, I wouldn't see the 4 projects as competing against one another on the same topic. We all use different methods, different fields, and clearly the object of research is not the same for the 4 projects. But we certainly have a lot to say to each other. And at the end of the day, obviously, given the nature of the funding of the Liège 2020 program, I think one of our goals is also to make an impact on European policymaking. And here, I think we should carefully reflect about what kind of impact we want to make and how we can achieve this impact. As a researcher, I work both on climate governance and on migration governance. And I'm very struck by the obvious differences in the way I relate to policymakers in both fields. When it comes to climate change, I very often interact with climate or environment ministers and agencies. We are often invited into policy fora, and even though climate policies remain insufficient so far, at least I have the impression that they are somehow rooted in science and in scientific evidence, and that in a way science is informing policymaking. When it comes to migration governance, I'm very struck by the fact that during the whole course of my career, I've never met a single minister of the interior. I've never been invited by Frontex. I've never met the head of Frontex. I've never met the EU Commissioner for Migration and Asylum. And basically, the contacts we have with migration policymakers are extremely limited. And very often, I feel, and I think I speak on behalf of many of us, I feel that policymakers act just as if we did not exist and as if research on these topics was non-existent. I'm sure that migration policymakers are aware that research exists, but very often my impression is that migration and asylum policies are decided purely on an ideological basis, completely independently from scientific evidence. And I think that should be a concern, certainly for us researchers. And I feel that very often we're identified by migration policymakers as political opponents who would just like to open the borders freely and who are not considerate for the actual difficulties of policymaking in that area. And I think we should reflect on this with policymakers, but we should also try and see how we can better organize ourselves. And I think that there is still the feeling, contrary to climate science, for example, that social sciences are less robust than natural sciences, that we are less organized, and that in a way we disagree more with each other. And even though the projects are very different from one another, and even though there are indeed significant differences in our approaches, I think we should be able to agree on a basic consensus of what science says about migration and asylum. And in that regard, I think initiatives like the one that has been taken a few years ago to initiate an international panel on migration and asylum to basically produce a synthesis of knowledge towards policymakers would be very useful, in the same vein that the IPCC has been existing for now more than 30 years to inform policymaking on climate change. And I think that is something important that would be welcome, and I hope that these 4 sister projects possibly can advance that significantly. But I think, and we shouldn't be afraid of saying so, I think we have a real problem in the way research on migration and asylum does not translate into actual policymaking and what can be done about that. And I think that we need to make an effort on both sides, on the side of researchers, but also on the side of policymakers.
Yeah, thanks, François. Yeah, this notion of like the IPCC of migration research has come up. I don't know when it was, 4, 5, 6 years ago or so, but somehow disappeared again or so. And I think it's certainly an idea that could be taken up again, and maybe should be even fostered. Yeah, also by the Commission with whatever the new pact on migration and asylum might be or might become. Because you already addressed some of the questions and issues, and this notion sort of that often there's the sense that our research is not being acknowledged or not being seen. I wanted to ask Julian again from the AdMIGov project, because I also saw, I mean, Luca mentioned it before as well. I mean, I think it was in March and April, there has been a call by quite a large number of researchers also involved in these projects here, which was directed to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and others. And in this call, sort of, it was reiterated the availability and an offer by these researchers to support clearly necessary improvement of migration policies, and also improvement of the border regimes and asylum regimes. But it was also directly criticized this what has been called by Barakalia the fund but disregard logic of social research in this field. So would be interesting to hear sort of also again sort of what kind of response you have received to this letter, and in general sort of is it an expectation sort of that you share that our project's findings are, well, bluntly ignored by stakeholders, or yeah, you posted in a talk we had before, are we selling them the wrong messages that might not be attractive to those people who are really involved in the closed circuits of policymaking?
Thank you, Ben. Yes, so the letter in question was sent, as you mentioned, early March. At the time, we had a concern related to reports of violence against persons that were attempting to cross the land border between Greece and Turkey, but also the fencing off of asylum and migration camps in the Aegean in the context of what was then the nascent COVID-19 pandemic. So the letter warned about the lack of coordinated EU action. It asked that the same kind of health and safety measures that were extended to EU citizens should be extended to persons who were either detained or held in camps because they are among the most vulnerable in the Union. And it expressed indeed this frustration at the fact that the EU has invested 100 million, at least as Luca mentioned, on research in migration issue, but yet the evidence, the knowledge, the recommendations that were produced by this research and are being produced by this research are not being listened to. And yes, indeed, Barak Kalir and Céline Cantat brought up this idea of the fund but disregard dynamic. So to answer your question, the Barak Kalir and Akis Papatiakis, who are the AdmiGov colleagues who coordinated the letter, have recently received a reply from the Commissioner for Innovation and Research, Maria Gabriel, dated to June 2020. The letter does acknowledge the concerns that were expressed in our initial communication, and it also stresses, and to quote the Commissioner's reply, that a direct link is being facilitated between grant holders and officials working on migration, and including in the context of this upcoming new pact on migration. This is what Luca mentioned as well. So this meeting that some of us attended, most of us actually attended at the end of January. Now, there's 2 points I think to bring up here. The first one is how is it, why is it that the evidence, the kind of research-based evidence that is produced in the EAST project, why is it that it is not being considered? Is it a matter of messaging, as you ask? I think that as we all know, as migration researchers, evidence is not the only thing that shapes migration policy, right? In fact, we know that migration policy, like any other policy area, is shaped by contrasting and, quite frankly, very often conflicting knowledge claims. So it's scientific expertise, scientific research is but one source of that kind of knowledge claims. And what evidence or knowledge gets picked up and is regarded as legitimate will depend very much on overarching policy narratives, what we call narratives. The stories that break down a particular issue into problems to be addressed and solutions to this problem. And in the case of the EU, and François was already mentioning this in his comments, in the case of migration governance in the EU, there's a prevailing narrative that the EU and Schengen area and the member states are under too much pressure. And this term comes back very often, pressure from third country nationals, particularly from North and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is despite available evidence, including from very official sources, the UN Population Division, for instance, that show that movements of persons, for example, between African countries or within and between South and East Asian countries are considerably more important than inter-regional mobility, so the kind of mobility that reaches, that leads to the territory of EU and Schengen states. So there is, and these narratives are not just words, they're not just ideas floating in the air. They're very substantially embodied in measures that shape current EU migration governance measures. For example, the mandate and priorities of EU bodies and agencies such as Frontex or the European Asylum Support Office. So it's not just a matter of providing appropriate evidence or good quality evidence. It's also a matter of how the discussion, the policy making itself is shaped and the kind of inertia, of path dependency, if you want to use technical terms, that is involved here. And so that's the first point. I think the second point is, and with regard to the Commissioner's reply, and we will, Barak Kalir is currently coordinating a reply to this as well. We have not seen clear evidence of this link beyond the possibility of meeting with Luca and some of our colleagues, which is very nice and very welcome, but not necessarily what we're looking for. Right? What we're looking for is a structural way in which policymaking can be compelled to take research-based evidence into account and has to provide explanations when such evidence is disregarded. And it would seem that, given this narrative of migratory pressure, it is very important to establish such a structural mechanism. However, and I think I'll join also a caveat that François formulated in this, there are also questions to be raised about creating a situation where research-based evidence directly feeds into policy, right? We know as researchers that scientific knowledge, it takes time to build. And the way in which, and we've seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, and I think the case of, indeed, of climate change is a really good example. We see how scientific disagreement about results, about evidence, can be instrumentalized. And climate skeptics and climate denier groups, I think, are the best example of this here. Picking on what are disagreements about data in order to challenge the overall findings of an entire research field. So we have to be careful about, I think, these claims that policy is driven by science. And we've heard this in the UK with regard to the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen this in Sweden, to some extent in Belgium as well. So it would, yes, to establish some kind of structural mechanism, but at the same time, and joining François' conclusions here as well, it's not just about scientists, researchers kind of getting an education about how to feed into policy, but it's also about how educating policymakers and the public about what actually scientific work is about. And the fact that very, often some of the results we get are preliminary, they're tentative, they're subject to contradictory debate. And in order to do research properly, we need these to be able to have these debates. Thank you.
Maybe Jürgen, you can follow up on this. You showed also with your end user panel and the other things you're doing in MAGYC project or so, that you're also trying to involve policy makers or people from practice in different ways in the very early stages of the project. But in general, also linking up with what François and Juliet just discussed, I sometimes also wonder sort of this policy component, how important that it really is for us in our work. And so we certainly are split in ourselves as well with our own ambitions, and also in this project, in how far we can achieve academic excellence, and in how far also this policy impact is actually something that can be achieved as well. Or so is it about policy impact, or is it about societal impact of the kind of research we're also producing?
Yes, I think this discussion took a really interesting turn in terms of the tension that you outlined at the start between sort of academic excellence and policy impact. I don't actually feel that so strongly. Maybe because MAGYC is such a large project that it really spans from the fundamental questions of why do people migrate? How does development affect migration? To the more specific policy questions. And I think that continuity is really, really important for us to have. And I think we also shouldn't, in a way, overestimate our role in the process of formulating policy, not just because of what Julien pointed to with the fact that, the ideological framing is often so much more important than the policy, than the research input to policy formulation. But also, I think most of our projects will never see the full picture of policy formulation, and I think part of it is about influence that is problematic. For instance, like you pointed to the parallels with climate skeptics trying to influence how climate science is used or abused. But I think even if we, in a way, trust the policy development process in not having bad intentions, there will be other concerns that have to be combined with our policy input, even in a sort of a sound policy process. And then that's there's a gradual transition into the more problematic sides of policymakers having to follow the demands of democratic processes. And for instance, now we know that the electorates in Europe are skeptical towards migration, and we could imagine a scenario where the people of Europe vote in ways that say we don't want people from other parts of the world to come here, and then the Commission reaches out to the scientific community and asks, what is the best science for keeping these people away? And I think most of us would have big ethical concerns in responding to that challenge at the same time as it's a logical consequence of democratic processes. So I think there is a difference also in the relation or the parallel with climate science in the sense that it's so hard to disentangle the political aspects from the sort of scientific aspects in a lot of migration issues. And that's why I think we shouldn't be naive in the sense of thinking that if we just manage to get attention to the evidence and reach through with our findings, then sort of justice and common sense will prevail, because there are real political dilemmas and different interests that compete with each other. And I think engaging with that as researchers is hard on both sort of an ethical level and the scientific level. But I think just to get back to your list of questions, and the first one about what kinds of research do we want to produce, I think actually it's important to emphasize that the research has to be good, because that is the starting point for also making an impact. It's never enough to make an impact, but it's a necessary requirement to make an impact. And I think probably all of us, when we work on this, realize that it is really complicated matter that we're engaging with. And if we take sort of the stereotypical social science solution and just end by saying, this is all very complex and we need to consider all the nuances, then we're not really making a difference. So we have to be able to say things that people listen to and that make them think in new ways, at the same time as we have to be true to the scientific nature of what we're doing. So it's not rocket science in the sense that we're not working on rockets, but it is rocket science in the sense that it's really hard what we are trying to understand and convey to diverse audiences. And although I don't know enough about climate science to compare, I feel that it's a big challenge to come up with these sort of simple conclusions on migration, given all the variation across groups and flows and contexts and so on. So struggling with this this complexity on one hand, and then the need to say something that are listened to and make a difference on the other hand is something that we're grappling with, and which is also why we can't sort of do the research first and think about communication afterwards. We have to think about both at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Jürgen. I mean, I would also like to underscore sort of this notion of academic excellence, that is really sort of the base and the baseline, and which is hard and difficult enough in this very complex, also very complex empirical settings, in which we're trying to undertake our research, and then to really develop consolidated and sound findings also in order that it's a basis that can be taken up for policy recommendations at different levels. But I also want to address you mentioned also an ethical dilemma already, and then I want to also mention another ethical dilemma and ask Caroline more about this, sort of in terms of the knowledge that we're kind of producing. We're producing this knowledge, well, some would say on the back of refugees and other migrants, some would say together with displaced people or with mobile people. Certainly, we're often doing research with people who are in a very precarious situation themselves, and who also ask us bluntly, okay, well, how do I benefit from that? You know, what's the purpose of all of this? If all of the findings go to the European Commission or to the governments or so, what is in there for me? And I'd like to ask Caroline there, sort of, you know, what has been your experience in this regard in the context of your research on displacement in the Democratic Republic of Congo? So where, you know, does our responsibility start and end? Yeah, and how can we on the other hand, also engage with participants in our research and feedback our findings, because we also have a responsibility to them, let's say.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. I have to admit that I find this a very difficult question, also a very difficult part of our research. As a researcher who is directly involved in the collection of data, I feel that we have the responsibility to not simply pass on condensed information through reports and to share numbers, the type of information that is often requested, that is easy to digest, but also to tell people stories and to give a voice to the people that we meet, to make these statistics come alive and to increase understanding about their position, even though the space is often quite limited for that. So if you would know that Mama Beatrice, for instance, saw how rebels killed her husband in front of her and then burned her house, and if you would know that whenever she returns to her village, she's still haunted by these memories, you would better understand that return is not a durable solution for her, even though her village is no longer seen as insecure. You would also better understand why she is so keen on succeeding in the city and taking up whatever job she can find. If you would know that Kazi was recruited in an armed group and managed to escape 6 months later, you would understand why he is avoiding close contacts in the neighborhood and hiding his background. You would also better understand why he has the physical strength and endurance to carry out the hard labor of digging latrines, and why he does not care much about the stigma around this profession. If you would know that Bamu is taking care of his younger orphan siblings and is covering their school fees, you would better understand why he has not yet managed to build his own family with the income he gets from selling airtime, why he feels his own life is on hold, but is nevertheless proud of his achievements. If you would know all the efforts that Daquinja went through to set up her small restaurant, you would better understand her proudness and her eagerness to become integrated in the city. And if we as researchers ask people's time to tell us about their lives, we also have the responsibility to share these stories. But I often feel very limited in this, and I'm never able to tell you all the stories that we hear, all the suffering that people have gone through, and all the efforts that they make to rebuild their life. What I still find the hardest part in doing an interview is closing off the conversation. That's the moment when we usually ask people whether they have any remaining questions to us, whether there's anything they want to add, whether there's a message they want to share with us. And within this humanitarian context, in which many of us carry out data collection, respondents often ask us what they can expect in return for providing all this information. And we don't have a very satisfying answer to this. We are not there to take stock of their needs and to come back some days later with the aid they would like to get. We are not able to have a direct impact on their lives and to decide on policy changes because we have our limits. And the only thing that we can do is to navigate between the worlds of our respondents and of policymakers and practitioners to mobilize our networks, to pass on the information that we get from respondents and to share this with a wider audience and then hope that their stories will be listened to. But unfortunately, we are quite limited in this.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. I think these, yeah, I mean, the personal experiences we also have as researchers. I mean, that's also something that motivates us, right? To stand in there and to try to make something out of our findings, and not only publish another journal article, but that we really would want to see, once you've spoken with somebody who crossed the Mediterranean and risking his life, or you spoke with somebody who has lost loved ones in the context of war or so, you would want to change something about it. And this is really also something that motivates us. And I think it's true also that some of the narratives also that we're encountering, they can be also very, very powerful and they can be a lot more powerful than more aggregated, neutral or objective data in large data sets that we acquire. And maybe there's also other alliances we have to form there, also with media or so, to inform a policy or influence policy through the back door, also by sharing these narratives. I would like to hand back to Luca and asking you again. So, I mean, it has been addressed before, sort of the different, of course, it's also different interests, different logics, different discourses that shape policy making, and also very different time frames. Sort of, you really see how quickly, you know, there's, I mean, the crisis situation that emerges and that often nobody foresaw, and then policy reacts and also tries to react very quickly. Whereas sort of we have long circles of research projects and findings to consolidate and want to be really sure what we say before we communicate anything towards other circles. What do you think about this general the dilemma in this field? Sort of this, you know, the quick and quick needs also by policy making, and the ability also of us researchers in our projects to react also to the needs of policy making.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I think you can hear me. My mic is on. So yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. I think it's maybe a bit hard after the great presentation from Caroline on the personal stories, really, to go back to the more dryness of this policy research relation. But anyway, I'll try. I think you mentioned timing, let's say, as an aspect kind of hindering, let's say, or playing an important role in these relations between migration and policy. First of all, on this, I'm not amongst those entirely convinced that it's just a matter of timing or it's just a matter of clarity and modes of presentation. You know, timing, as you say, there's a crisis that hits, but and then you need rapid resources or knowledge, etc. But there's such a immense and big body of knowledge on migration that it's not just a matter of timing, that you can't have new knowledge produced to respond to that crisis. I mean, there's a lot of which to build upon already. So I think that's, these elements are part of the question, but don't really kind of nail it entirely. I think one thing, let's say, to be a bit even more practical or pragmatic, in the sense that this is something I stress often with projects, and is that policy implications does not only mean directing messages at policymakers or recommending things at policymakers, and it's been touched upon by also previous panelists. Jorgen in particular mentioned how they do it, you know, with their end users boards and panels, etc. But really, it's first and foremost, I think, aiming for policy relevance means including in your work considerations and really understandings of decision-making contexts. So really, to understand deeper these contexts in which the decisions on migration are made. Things like, you know, who are the actors involved and the stakeholders associated with your decision, with the decisions that you're discussing. What frames shape the environment and define the constraints of the actors that are that need to take these decisions. What needs to change in those contexts, so that your recommendation can really find space. So what else needs to change before your recommendations can actually get there? What political and financial trade-offs are associated with these changes that you are proposing? But I think to really be comprehensive in coming forward to policy circles with robust evidence that can have a stronger policy implication, you really need such a, let's call it a theory of change, as it's often called in, you know, public policy literature or something. And you know, then this can then incorporate, for example, feedback loops, which were referred to, between practitioners and researchers throughout the lifetime of projects, and this can really facilitate an uptaking. I think the way of producing knowledge and just directing it to those people responsible for then using it is is a way that, from my experience at least, in working in these circles, is really bears little chance of actually getting us somewhere in squaring the circle which we're discussing today. So I know what I'm suggesting is really kind of time consuming, and we would not expect any kind of all researchers that want to do my research on migration to just always include these aspects of analysis in their work. But I think that that's the difference that I was discussing before, is that with Horizon research, this is actually what we would be looking for, because we are looking for this impact, which in some way is subordinated to these analyses that I was referring to before, I think. It's great to see also how many researchers in these projects are really trying to adapt when starting a Horizon 2020 grant, to find these ways to actually, develop something which is not maybe part of their daily lives as researchers in a particular field of expertise. But this is, I think, even the value added of Horizon. I believe it gives space to do this. Ourselves in the future, we will make sure that the calls are more explicit also in really these pathways towards this impact, in what we are asking for. Even evaluators will be briefed on this. Really, it becomes a central part of Horizon Europe, our next framework program. And I think that carrying this work out is really important, as it allows then to open the black box of policymaking, which is slightly simplified, I feel. Maybe even in normally in discussions, different actors at different levels are just lumped together. And in this phrase of policymakers, who are policymakers? I speak to many of my colleagues in the commissions, and we sometimes reflect on this, and compared to maybe the criticism that are often moved towards someone or they didn't really know they had so much power, because they feel completely constrained in a particular environment. So knowing these things really help to better situate yourself with your evidence and the knowledge that you're producing. Again, what frames define their context, etc. So I think this can really be helpful in going beyond this seeming clash that is sometimes considered and referred to between research and policymakers, which I think is pretty much artificial. It's not there in the practice, really in the way we share ideas about migration at the most basic level. I think I really cannot see it. Maybe this is just autobiographical a bit, but as you mentioned, I worked a bit in research and in policy context and back again and back and forth a bit. And I could really appreciate how this divide is not there, and how many of the policymakers working on migration actually shared the same values and principles of many researchers with which I worked in the research world. So I think a better analysis of these contexts and these could really help in pushing for this change. There's a big body of work, in research in public policy, in governance studies, which I think could really be useful in the case for migration. I'm thinking about, I don't know, in my previous work, I considered work of Paul Carney or Christina Boswell or Jean-Pierre as regards governance. But there's people that have studied these relations that go beyond even migration. I think pertain more to public policy, even more in general, and can really be useful in our sense. I don't know how I'm doing with time, because I had a few notes I noted down, and then I want to say something on the letter as well. I don't know if I'll take it up now or later.
Maybe 2 more minutes or so would be okay.
Okay, good. Okay, so just 2 points maybe I wanted to conclude if we've got the time. The first of all, we the letter was mentioned by Julien, and it was good to receive it, I think, and to see it circulate, to discuss it with some colleagues. I think it creates a reflection, which is important. I'll take up maybe some points on the notion of funding but disregarding, which maybe can be useful also to framing our next kind of iterations or exchanges in this sense. First of all, of course, I share the general empathy for underlying argument of needing to include more research finding into policy developed. I think that we've worked closely with most of you in the panel and in the projects to that end, so you know that already, of course. I think that in some instances, though, this funding but disregarding may lead to some sort of also let's say naivety, because I can't find a better word, but regarding the politics of migration, which were also mentioned by previous panelists, and by Jorgen in particular, the political dilemmas associated with changes and choices. I can't remember actually if it was the letter of an article that followed afterwards which referred to this, because there were the two things, but there was this implication that policymaking is not done based on evidence, but rather based on political dynamics. You know, of course we need to strengthen the presence and the role of research in policy, but we should not be too simplistic in that not by funding, let's say, certain research, this does not equate automatically to taking it into consideration. I think what I'm saying here is that the complexities of migration governance and relations between research and policy are there more profoundly, and it's not a funding mechanism which simply allows to have a direct access into policies developed. I think that's a point in relation to this funding but disregarding. It's not much the fact that that there's this funding in particular, but the problem is wider, I think than that. Horizon, does give the opportunity and requires to develop work a bit more tailored to policy, and we are trying to really do our best to facilitate this exchange. But then, you know, researchers need to navigate the difficulties as a difficult political and policy topic. I think just like as research funded elsewhere, I think. So yeah, maybe I just wanted to make this nuance, decoupling a bit the issue of funding research, because we recognize these particular priorities. But then obviously this is framed within a bigger difficulties regarding the context, and I think we should maybe be addressing, or we should focus on addressing those more in general, not just relating to the funding. And I had a few more points, but I think I'll have to close it there, and then if I have time in the Q&A, I'll take them up. Thanks a lot.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Luca, for these explanations. And I think it's also true, sort of, that as researchers, I think we need to better understand and really know, sort of, how policy making actually works, and sort of, and where are the points in time, and who are the key actors and persons, or so, where and how we can actually feed in our respective findings. I want to turn to some of the questions that have been raised through the Q&A. Thanks for those who post some questions. Cannot address all, but maybe one comment, or rather a question, I think it also relates directly to what Luca just said. Sort of, if we aim for more transdisciplinary projects where science and research cater to concrete real-life problems and movements, we also need to speak about the way academic work is funded. That means we need to talk about how calls for grants are also formulated, and which kind of science gets funding. And also, just as a very critical note, sort of, when I actually read a lot of the calls, also in the Horizon program, now Horizon Europe program, actually I get the shivers, how strong the whole securitization agenda is implicit in all of these, or in many of these calls. Sort of also asking myself, okay, is that actually, and also the division of budgets that goes into more technical approaches towards securing borders and supporting this whole securitization agenda. I think a lot of excellent scientists are also very discouraged, and also say, well, look, the European Union is not somebody who wants to fund, or by whom we want to be funded in order to being able to do independent research. So that was not a question, but rather a comment, and I think that is relevant. And then also a very important comment made by colleagues from the University of Sussex. A lot of our projects now also in this field, and this also has been a particular call to us, they will be navigate in our research and also engagement with policy between also two worlds, in the global south problems and in the global north. And it's a sort of reflecting our responsibilities and limits beyond immediate policy impacts. What can we, here sort of means we as European researchers, what can we do to make, to disrupt opposition or as gatekeepers to the production of knowledge in an unequal world? What can European migration researchers do to make sure we are not reproducing colonial discourses, particularly when looking at migration from the so-called global south to Europe? Reflect about it. Who wants to answer that? And then another question by a colleague who says, I'm a lay person, but quite keen on this topic regarding the research visibility or acceptance by government agents. Could you give an example on how your research could be translated into actionable insights to produce change by those agents? So again, a question about, you know, the long steps from research findings to formulation of actually steps that can be taken up also by practitioners or policy as well. So who wants to go first?
Maybe I can say a few words about how the research can be translated into actionable insights to produce change by government agents or policymakers. I think here is that policymakers perhaps could be more transparent with us. And we all know that policymaking is not one block. And very often it is important to acknowledge that policymaking is complex and is the result of a negotiation by a wide range of actors. And I think that policymakers perhaps should be more open to us in acknowledging the difficulties that they have to frame some types of policies and how research can help them get there. But I think it's extremely important for us researchers not to transform ourselves into policymakers. We should remain researchers, and even though our research can and should inform policy, I think that it shouldn't be driven only by policymaking. And I think that it's really important that we stick to this, because if not, in a way we jump the fence and we become policymakers ourselves. So I really think that our research should be evidence-driven rather than policy-driven.
Yes, I agree. Jürgen, you want to follow up?
Two other examples on how we can make a difference in terms of policy. So we've done a lot of work on migrant remittances, and about a decade ago, there was a situation in Norway where most immigrants from Somalia, for instance, had no way of sending money to their countries of origin legally. And since all the media attention around remittances was focused on things like terrorist financing, tax evasion, benefit fraud, money laundering, then the whole atmosphere around remittances was very negative. And we managed to show through our research both that a lot of people lacked legal ways of helping their family, and that most remittances were of that kind. And then we had the right kind of timing and combination of our input from the research side, policy changes at the European level, and some politicians who took an interest in the matter. And then we managed to contribute to a liberalization of the market, which made it cheaper and easier for more migrants to send money. A very different alternative is not really so much from our experience, but at the height of the migration crisis in 2015-16, many European countries basically said that now we've received so many asylum seekers that we have to restrict their rights to family reunification, because otherwise there will just be too many people. And then researchers played an important role in pointing out that, well, if European countries do that, then one of the results will be that instead of men going on their own across the Mediterranean and then bringing their wives and children afterwards, will have more women and children also taking the dangerous journey. And in a way that made it visible what kind of political choice was being made. And I think often that is exactly our role, to make it apparent that choices that politicians present as simple and logical have consequences that they need to confront politically.
Okay, Caroline, also maybe please address the issues about the whole global North-South post-colonial dimension of our research.
Yeah, I wanted to say about this that what I think is really important as well is to realize that behind our research teams, there's also in-country teams. So if I do research in Congo, I'm not talking on behalf of a research team with colleagues with whom I've been working since 2012, since 2014 already. And it's important to, like, of course, as a European-based researcher, I have sort of an advantage in the sense that I know better what funders are asking for, what sort of calls are coming up. And I think it's important to engage local or in-country research teams in early stages, in the earliest stage possible. And of course, there is often the issue of translation. It takes time to translate calls for proposals, for instance, into French. You don't have this direct reading, but what I do and what I think is really important is to make sure that you start your analysis also together. So it's not just me reading the data and reading the notes of the researchers locally, but sitting together for some intensive days of discussion, talking with them about the findings, what they take from it, and not start with the notions and the questions the European funder has, but also start with what they think is interesting and relevant and important to share. And that, of course, again, I think there's always some bias and there's always some inequality in this relationship, because funding often comes from European funders, from Western funders. So therefore, I think we need to make sure that we are aware of this bias and that we start our analysis from the local questions as well, and not just from the questions that funding agencies have. But yeah, there are, of course, shortcomings, and I think we still have quite a way to go in making these relationships more equal. But it starts with jointly writing proposals, jointly doing the data collection, jointly analyzing and jointly publishing about it, which I think is very important. But it's a process that takes quite some time, because of course, if you write on your own, it can sometimes be quicker than if you have to consult others and you have to send back and forth. But it's also very inspiring and very worthwhile, because I'm sure that some of the articles that I've written have been sort of greatly inspired and fed by the joint analysis that we do. And that's why I think it's also important to make sure and to acknowledge this in co-authorship, for instance. But that tends to be overlooked sometimes as well.
Yeah. So before we close, sort of our time is always up. I also would like to give the floor again to Julia and Luca. Are there last things that you would want to raise or add to our discussions?
Thanks, Ben. I'll be very quick. The first point is why is it that we do H2020 projects? And we don't apply for these projects because we want to be policy relevant. We apply for these projects because there's that little bit of research that we want to do, and that we need the resources to do so, right? So underlying this whole discussion of policy relevance and funding is the fact that migration and social science research in general in Europe has suffered. And that the resources we have are not the ones that we would need to do the work that we would like to do. Second point is we're not only researchers or policy relevant knowledge workers, whatever you want to call us, we're also educators. And I think that's pretty much where a lot of us can make a difference, is in the classroom. And in the classroom, we get students, if we're lucky, from all over the place. And the last point, and that's kind of a reaction also to what Luca mentioned, we know that in research and innovation funding by the European Commission, and from observation, some projects and some orientations have more clout than others. If you look, and Benjamin, you mentioned this, at the research funded under the FP7 security research, the research funded under secure societies, a lot of it applied technical stuff. It seems to be easier to get a research project about a land-based unmanned vehicle patrolling the borders than it is to get about, like, researching asylum and international protection conditions in North Africa, for instance. So not every project is equal, and that goes back to the point we were making about narratives. Some projects coincide better with the overarching story that is being told about migration governance in Europe. Thank you.
Luca, do you want to share last thoughts, or?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, maybe just very quickly, because I had so many things I noted down. No, first of all, it was a really interesting conversation, and I know your projects have still a few years to go, so I'm really looking forward in taking that up in the future as well. I think maybe there's two things very quickly. One comes out of the discussions we were having, and also what François was mentioning on the difficulties and knowing more about the difficulties that policymakers face, etc. And also referring to what I was saying before and the link between ideology and policymaking that was made in discussions before. I think an aspect in which researchers can really be important in shifting narrative and framing is starts from the fact that it's really understanding, it's as simple as understandings of migration that drive the work of policymakers. So it's really understandings of causes and consequences of migration that drive the work that they do. So by understanding how, what causes migration, really, whether it is conflict, whether it is environmental issues, whether it is the pull factor of welfare benefits, these are all whole dimensions which then frame the way that you act upon your beliefs. And this is something that sometimes I feel is overlooked by some researchers, which come with their own ideas about how migration takes place, and they don't necessarily have this conversation with the people they are talking to in policy or politics. And it's actually the first underlining block between for that relation going forward is actually that. So maybe just to comment on this idea of where there could be an input for change. I think this is a really important aspect to consider. Well, based on my experience and also my previous research, I think really considering how understandings of causes of migration then lead to actions, and starting from there, I think that's step one in the big journey towards change and changing certain policy developments. I'll close it there because I know we're short of time, and I'll follow up with the other comments in the future iterations.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Luca, as well. I think the last point you mentioned, I think is particularly important also that migration is often being looked at as a problem, and sort of need for policymakers to understand what causes migration, and still quite a linear understanding of migration, sort of the old push-pull model or so that still is so influential in the whole policy debate, I would say. And I think it's part of our responsibility as researchers also to show, well, there are different models, right? There are a lot more nuances to mobility and immobility of people, and rather to see, okay, what are the processes, right, that are involved, and in how far maybe transformations and changes are evoked through mobility, rather than seeing the migration as topic as such, or mobility as a topic, or even as a problem as such. One other point I would like to mention as well is not only sort of that we are doing interdisciplinary research and that we're doing international research, but also transdisciplinary research. So the inclusion in the design of our research projects of people from policy, from humanitarian organizations, from practice, from different parts of the world, I think is really something that we have to take, and that we are taking very, very seriously. And that also helps us, I think, sometimes as researchers to be and stay a bit grounded also, and it's an important point for us, sort of for our internal discussions in our projects. But nonetheless, sort of the imbalance also between those who have better access to funds and to the people who can initiate such projects with these larger grants, that imbalance and also the imbalance in the distribution of the funds within the projects between those who are based in the north and the south, that this nonetheless often remains. And I think this is also certainly something that will have to be addressed in the future, also in future calls. I think that a lot of the funding goes directly more to partners in the global south and not so much through the global north. Okay, I'm sorry to the audience that François has one last point. Before, no, okay, so he's saying goodbye already. I'm sorry to the audience that we couldn't address all the questions, but we're taking them certainly in our work. We will be reflecting about them, and please make sure yourself sort of that you also try to stay in contact with the projects. Sort of on the website, you see the links to the respective projects, and with the respective contact information. All of us researchers are visible there with our respective email addresses or so. If we didn't address some of these questions that you posed, please contact us again. So it would be great to stay in touch, and it would also be great if you join us for the next webinar at the end of August on the impacts of the Corona pandemic on migration governance, taking place on the 25th of August. Before I close, I would nonetheless I would like to thank. I would first thank you, the panelists, Luca, Julien, Caroline, Jürgen, and François, who just left us for this very engaging, very interesting discussion. I think we're quite sure sort of that this has been the starting point of our discussions, and we're very much looking forward to taking this further in the future and also digging deeper in many parts. But I also would like to thank Christiane Fröhlich from GIGA in the MAGYC project, and to Martin Wagner from ICMPD, and Camilla Vogli from ICMPD, and Maritim, and Lars Wirkus and Gisem Güseland from BICC. Sort of our joint collaboration of the past weeks enabled that we now had this very nice, and I think, kickoff, which also worked technically quite well, which I was a bit nervous about, but I'm now very happy how it evolved. And
not least, thank you to all the attendees who signed in and followed us. It's really inspiring for us to see not only each other's faces, but also the long list of names, some that we are familiar with and many others. So thanks a lot for coming virtually to listen to us and ask questions.
Yeah, I didn't have the time to browse through the list of participants yet, but I will do so later. But yeah, we really look forward to engage with you in the next webinars, and also as an offer to other Horizon 2020 projects or so. If there's some topic that you would want to table in this field, broad field of migration, displacement, and asylum, please also get in contact with us. And we see also that the balance of the people involved as panelists or so is always well balanced at least. Okay, well, thanks to all. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll have a nice summer until we see another again. Thanks a lot.